just now. Let's just go ahead and get started. We are very fortunate today to have two speakers, both professors here at UMBC. First, we'll have Dr. Blake, who's an assistant professor of political science in the Department of Political Science at UMBC, focus his talk on some constitutional issues and the state's role in police power and implications in terms of the 14th Amendment as a result of COVID-19. And that'll be followed by Dr. Susan Sterett, who is a professor of public policy at UMBC, who focuses on issues around jurisprudence and law and the courts, and is going to focus her talk really on some of the different dimensions of litigation that we've seen as a result of COVID-19, particularly in terms of insurance, as well as maybe some habeas petitions around prisons. So I think it's going to be a set of very interesting talks. As a result of having two different speakers, we'll try to go for, probably closer to 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A session. So without further ado, thank you both for joining us today. And Dr. Blake, feel free to let us know, what you're seeing. So thank you.
Well, Eric, thank you so much for having me, and thanks to all of you for logging on and taking advantage of this really outstanding speaker series that Dr. Stokan has put together. So I want to talk just for a minute or two about how COVID, in some senses, has turned ordinary issues of constitutional law completely on their head. That the things that the government is doing during the COVID pandemic are things that during more normal periods of politics, if the stakes weren't as high for COVID, the things that I'm about to talk about in the next few minutes would be ruled unconstitutional. And not only that, there would be a broad bipartisan agreement that these government actions are unconstitutional. So how should we make sense of the fact that the Constitution can mean one thing during normal times and something very different in sort of times of emergency? So there are two concepts that I want to try to communicate as a foundation before we go through a couple of the examples of how things have changed. The most important concept is to understand the authority of state governments. State governments, unlike the federal government, have a sort of broad mandate through which that they can pass new laws. Congress can only pass laws that relate to the topics of things that the Congress is allowed to address as listed in the Constitution. Congress is supposed to be limited to regulating the economy, setting up a postal system, regulating immigration, those sorts of things. State governments, their authority to act is they can pass any law that they think is a way to promote the health, safety, or welfare of its people. That's a much broader set of authority for a state government to act. But even within the authority for state governments to act, they still have to respect individual rights. And there have been all sorts of restrictions placed on the right of free speech, the right to freely exercise one's religion, rights to interstate travel, and not to be discriminated against for being a out-of-state resident. Property rights have changed as a result of government COVID policies. And of course, probably the biggest constitutional issue hasn't really occurred yet because we're still waiting on the science. And that is whether it is within the government's power to compel someone to be vaccinated against COVID when they have sincerely held religious beliefs. that prevent them from being vaccinated. As I said, during sort of normal times, the kinds of things that state governments have done around these different issues wouldn't be allowed. But things are, the Supreme Court wrote an incredibly influential opinion at the height of the Great Depression, saying that it's okay if the extent of government powers shifts during emergencies. The way they sort of justified this is they were not saying that the Constitution includes emergency powers, right? Powers that can that don't exist during normal times and do exist during times of emergency. What the court said was it was a case called Blaisdell versus Building and Loan Association. The court said emergency does not create power. Emergency does not increase granted power or remove or diminish the restrictions imposed upon power granted or reserved. The Constitution was adopted in a period of grave emergency. While emergency does not create power, emergency may furnish the occasion for the exercise of power. And what the court basically said was, every time a government gets taken to court, there's a trade-off between, there could be a trade-off between upholding a government policy that's trying to make people safe or more secure, and the trade-off on the other side is that it comes at the expense of liberty. During normal times, the courts are the ones who are sort of in charge of weighing the costs and benefits of the government's goal towards greater security against the harm that is being done to people's freedom. The difference is, during times of emergencies, the courts are going to be more deferential and say, okay, our elected officials considered what the trade-offs are to people's rights by enacting this kind of legislation. And if they are comfortable making these sorts of trade-offs, we're going to get out of the way and say that, you know, they're better determined because they're the experts on health law or the economy, right? And if they think that this is a sacrifice worth making, who are we to stand in the way? So it's not that the meaning of the Constitution changes during times of emergency. It's that the role of the courts shrinks. And more the decisions about the trade-offs that you make between sort of liberty and security, those go to elected officials during times of emergency in ways that courts would play a bigger role in making those decisions during normal times. And so, as I said, you know, the kinds of constitutional implications of emergency orders that have been made by governors are really profound. That if these policies are enforced, and that they're not always enforced, they have really profound implications for citizens to engage in free speech. The government absolutely could have cracked down on every Black Lives Matter protest over the summer because they constituted public gatherings above the allowed size. But in that instance, even though the government had the authority to do that, they chose to allow the protesters to gather. But it could have represented a really grave threat to free speech. The public gatherings restriction has been enforced a little bit more consistently to prevent people from meeting in person in houses of worship. And that has had some pretty severe implications for the right to freely exercise one's religion. But there are also some sort of less obvious ways in which the government's stay-at-home orders implicate constitutional rights. One is eminent domain. The government has started to seize motels and other private property to serve as places to set up COVID testing. And ordinarily, the government isn't allowed to just take private property unless it's for some sort of public purpose. So, if we need a piece of land to build a school or to build a military base, and the person doesn't want to sell, the government can just take that land. And now that they're using that constitutional power for the temporary seizure of property to help the governments implement some of its public health policies. The right to travel across state lines is being implicated in ways that would never be tolerated during normal times. It's sort of as simple as if you go to Vegas and get married, right, and you come back to Maryland, guess what? Like, you're still married, right? Like, we respect the rights of that as an American citizen. There are certain things that doesn't matter what state you go to, you're entitled to equal treatment. And we've seen stay-at-home policies. So, for instance, Delaware, for a while, set up stop checkpoints on their roads, and they would only allow residents of certain states to move past those checkpoints. And the screening criteria was, are you from a state where there's been a spike in COVID cases? And if the answer is yes, then you have to leave Delaware. And again, during normal times, one state would not be allowed to say, oh, well, we only want citizens from, rich Californians can visit Delaware, but people from West Virginia can't visit Delaware. That kind of discrimination against certain types of out-of-state residents would have been completely out of line. And then finally, there's going to be a big set of both political, public health, and constitutional arguments around a COVID vaccine and making it compulsory once the vaccine has been fully developed and is ready for distribution. The Supreme Court has made quite clear for over 100 years that religious liberty is not a sufficient justification to be granted an exemption from a compulsory vaccination law. There was a case brought to the court in 1905 challenging a Massachusetts law that required everyone to get vaccinated against smallpox. Someone said, well, it's against my religion to do that. And the Supreme Court said, we don't care. Again, it's the authority of the states to determine how to promote the health, safety, and welfare of its citizens. And as a judiciary, we are not going to second guess that determination. They knew that there were trade-offs between having a healthy public and respecting the religious rights of everyone. And they made that trade-off in a way that required people to become vaccinated. And the judiciary was not going to second guess that determination. And so, there are laws on the books that give people with religious objections or philosophical objections an exemption from other vaccination laws. But those laws could change. And the fact that there are constitutional that's a great question about privacy and not having the government intrude upon your private space literally with a needle. But there are other cases, not just from the smallpox era, but from the 1960s. The Supreme Court said that if you were suspected of driving drunk, and the only way to test whether or not you were would be to withdraw your blood, so your blood could be tested, because these were the days before breathalyzers had been invented, that it was a justifiable government intrusion into your private space in those circumstances. So from either a religious liberty perspective or a privacy perspective, the public health need to have everyone vaccinated trumps people's rights, so long as the government is willing to pass a law to that effect. But the Constitution will not likely protect the rights of those who do not wish to be vaccinated, because the courts, again, have been largely deferential to the decisions of elected leaders during public health crises and other crises like this. So I think I'm going to sort of wrap it up there. There are all sorts of other implications like that have been challenged in court, but I know that Dr. Sterett is going to be getting into some of those. So again, thank you so much to Erick for having me, and look forward to answering more of your questions a little bit later.
Great, thank you, Dr. Blake. All right, yeah, so we will just go straight to Dr. Sterett's talk. And I think you should be able to share, but let me know if you have any issues. Oh.
Fingers crossed. Oh, it showed up and everything? Okay, not that I can see it, but let's give it a shot. So thank you very much for inviting me to talk, and thank you to William for his overview of constitutional issues. I'm learning so much, and I hope that everybody is well in what I know are extremely difficult times and remain really difficult. I mean, not least of which that we can't see each other. I want to start with where we are. UMBC now has a land acknowledgement, and I deal with a lot of people, in particular in Canada and Australia, partly because I work on climate change, and they've been doing land acknowledgements for a long time. So I'm grateful that we've got that now. So I want to note that UMBC, which is the neighborhood many of us are in right now, was established upon the land of the Piscataway and Susquehannock peoples. Over time, citizens of many more Indigenous nations have come to live here, and we offer our respects to all past, present, and future Indigenous people connected to this place. Let's see, it's not clear that our governing institutions, our national governing institutions, can meet this moment. However, there's tremendous hope locally, and because we're at UMBC, I'm shifting now. I just want to note that for the city, we've got a health director who puts the health and well-being of the people of the city first, Dr. Jaraza, and she also, while she's working from home, and has a spouse who is running a software company, and both are UMBC alums. So that's very fun. And I want to recognize that many people, probably including people in this group, have losses in this pandemic, whether illness, time with friends, family members, jobs, or seeing businesses decline. So again, I want to start with recognizing where we are in multiple senses, physically and then in our general spaces. Okay, I want to launch in by saying that, that my focus through much of my career has been on courts and everyday life. So I am really, really grateful to William Blake of the Political Science Department talking about the Supreme Court as setting rules and the ways that that sets the context for what we're doing now. And one of the things that I turn to, again, for my whole career is in a way that I think fits with what a lot of you folks do in public policy, is thinking about governing with lawsuits as a process, often one that takes a really long time. So trial courts, temporary orders, those are called injunctions, that are often reviewed by higher courts, that are then remanded or returned to lower courts. It's enough to make your eyes cross. And some of that is getting a bit more press these days because of the election. And then many cases do what's called settle, which is that people agree on what an outcome will be, rather than necessarily going to the Supreme Court. Indeed, the United States Supreme Court not only have the kind of limits that Dr. Blake was referencing, but also they just hear very few cases every year, and that's gone down from the height of what they used to listen to when I was young. And then those lawsuits go to where the resources are. When you think about it, that's super common sense. So we're all drawn to the really visible parts. Again, mask orders, stay-at-home orders, not being able to go to places of worship. But when you think about it, and if you start with the principle that just like every other kind of governing, that court cases go to where the resources are, that is where there are favorable rules, where there's money, and where there are lawyers, it gives you a little bit of a different take for where the cases are. So again, this is my perspective. Hold on to this while you can, is that we're looking at the everyday stuff, things that you might run into while you're talking to friends and family, which actually indeed I have when I talk to people about what I'm working on, and lots of people have stories to raise. So where are the lawsuits filed that mention COVID-19? And here I want to acknowledge repeatedly a law firm named Hunton Andrews Kurth, which has a coronavirus complaint tracker. And they've been really generous about sharing information with me. So, and they've got somebody doing web scraping for case filings. So it's computer coding where I would have to find a student to work with. And again, I'm grateful. And then they've shared some original data with me. So this is from their website on the coronavirus complaint tracker. And in a way that's become, I think, intuitive for a lot of us who are looking at websites, darker color means more. So most of the lawsuits have been filed in California and New York, and then Texas and Florida. Those are big population centers, and they've had a whole lot of cases. That is, I really want to acknowledge the importance of cases that have been filed elsewhere, like what Dr. Blake is recognizing. So there have been lawsuits around closure orders, around masks, and it doesn't mean there are a whole lot, but they definitely get press and play into a lot of the divides that we have in this country. So some of it, the litigation is in the upper Midwest, for example, and early on you definitely saw things out of Seattle where there were a lot of lawsuits as well, a lot of early illness, as well as cruise boats landing which got the first press. Okay, what are most of these lawsuits? And again, let's thank Hunton Andrews Kurth. So this is from their website from September 28th. If you go to the COVID tracker, you'll see that it's just pretty much increasing proportionately. So almost all the lawsuits are insurance lawsuits. After that, there's civil rights lawsuits. So you get a lot of the business closure and stay-at-home orders that Dr. Blake talked about, and group gathering ban challenges. And then after that, they had counted 124 voting suits or lawsuits. One of the things I want to note is that the reach of COVID cases is way, way beyond what mentions COVID in the lawsuit. So there was actually a healthy elections tracker, which is still tracking. I didn't look at it this morning, but as of September 28th, when I was doing this, they had more than 400 voting lawsuits filed. And again, some of that's visible these days with regard to disputes over the election, but it was about various voting practices, part of it around mail-in. So again, some of that is around the election. But school closures and whether or not they would close, teachers, for example, were contesting closures. Another thing people don't necessarily think about so quickly is confinement cases. So prisoners and immigrants who are detained. Detention centers and prisons are often very crowded, and they are their conditions are perfect for spreading a very contagious virus. And so largely for confinement, it was public interest organizations, I can talk about those, and as well as public defenders who brought cases contesting sometimes for large groups of people and sometimes for individuals contesting detention conditions. And then again, you can see labor and employment. I don't want to hide them. Overall at this time, and it just didn't fit beautifully, there were more than 5,000 lawsuits filed. Most of these will get dismissed, or they'll disappear, or they'll get resolved some way that has nothing to do with either the state Supreme Court or the federal Supreme Court. So just keep in mind that boring capture, for most of us, I mean this in a very, we can't see each other in real life, so it's harder to see. But I mean this in a very friendly, flip way, but in a way that we don't usually tell stories about. Most of these claims are around insurance. What kind of insurance claims, you might wonder? For example, business continuity. So many people insure against disaster for their businesses, but the insurance companies are arguing and winning that it's largely for physical intrusion, like hurricanes and things, and people are losing claims. If they weren't covered by federal assistance, they're out of luck with their insurance companies, and that's provoked some discussions around legislation to fix that problem. That your insurance doesn't cover loss of business when there wasn't a physical intrusion, and they're not counting COVID-19 as a physical intrusion. Those are all largely brought by private attorneys who get paid fees. But the cases that we find really compelling are often told as stories, and courts are very much a storytelling kind of enterprise, and I'm very much trying to watch my time. But anyway, courts tell stories in disasters, and interest organizations are really interested in appealing to a broader public and not just winning in court. And so finding things they can use to tell stories. So the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a religious right organization that also litigates in anti-business regulation lawsuits, and I can reference you to scholarship on them, went to a lawsuit around religious freedom, exactly what Professor Blake is raising, but religious freedom is not going to allow you to get rid of masks. This is a current lawsuit. This is later on in the game. Earlier in the game, people were trying to contend that closures were unconstitutional, but lawsuits are sort of a series of games or a series of moves in a game, in a complex game. I've been meaning to watch Queen's Gambit. People tell me that's good about chess, but Alliance Defending Freedom is well mobilized, well funded, and they know how to make the next move. So this is about viewpoint discrimination in a school. They're arguing that the school banned a particular message when they allowed other kinds of political messages. This is in Mississippi, and this is how their website narrates the claim. The other one is a Christian conservative organization as well that is also around against business regulation. And a lot of these organizations, the business regulation ones that are also Christian conservatives, have in recent years done a great job of trying to build alliance, so they're around small businesses as well as larger businesses. So this story collapses COVID-19, Mr. Garola's story, and I apologize, my crappy pronunciation. Mr. Garola's story with COVID-19, mass incarceration, and then wildfires in the West. And I go to this because they are extremely important and because I have family in the West. So prisons, and I knew there'd be lawsuits. This was filed in June before the wildfire season in California or the American West had started, that anybody who knew anything knew it was going to start. Mr. Garola had fought fires as a prisoner, and most states, and again, this is a big issue in the American West, use prisoners for firefighting. But then in many states, including California, they cannot then use that experience to get firefighter jobs, which pay pretty well afterwards. You would think we'd want experienced people. Why can't they? Because they're convicted felons and they can't be licensed as EMTs. Emergency medical technicians. So this lawsuit, again, was generally against that rule, but it instantiates it or tells a story about it for one particular person. And there'd been ongoing lawsuits about mass incarceration and overcrowding in California prisons. And the state of California knew that it was facing wildfires. And so they, the governor, a little bit later in the summer, this is a June lawsuit, signed legislation saying everybody who had been a convicted felon and had firefighting experience could indeed become firefighters while outside of prison as well. So these are examples of the organizations that take lawsuits, and when they're trying to build public support, the way that they tell stories. Notice that they tell stories about individuals that are emotionally compelling and can draw alliances across other kind of political boundaries. Who else litigates? Notice what this is, and I wasn't doing it on purpose. I wanted to do a corporate law firm because that's where a lot of the big money is, and I wanted to do one of their storytelling ones, but they just don't have it up because they're not that concerned about necessarily building public support around issues. So this is around class action suits from Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher this morning, which is very involved in litigation. Why do I know that? Again, because I mean, partly because I watch websites, but I was at a social occasion, distant, outdoors, on a deck, where I started talking to an attorney at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, and she just completely lit up around lawsuits around COVID and started talking about the insurance cases and knew the website tracker that I was talking about. So notice that these are less easy to tell as stories, and they're not even trying. Many lawsuits don't go anywhere because you have agreed. Take a look if any of you have a credit card agreement or family members do. You've usually waived your legal rights and you agree to private, what's called arbitration, that is settlement according to private law, and contract agreements, because you can't get the service that you've signed on for, et cetera, all of which could be narrated, but that's not what they're worried about. A lot of insurance, some around refunds, particularly people who booked vacations that they couldn't follow through on, booked weddings, and so on. Interest organizations take closure orders, mask orders, imprisonment, information. The ACLU has been very, very involved on jails and prisons. Earlier, they had lawsuits around jails and prisons that did tell individual stories, but right now they are trying to access information via the federal access information that the federal government is not releasing with regard to their decision making about response to COVID-19 in jails and prisons. What I haven't listed here is public legal aid organizations, which are very limited in what they can take because they can't take cases all the way up to the Supreme Court. That's because of Congress and dates from the Reagan era, and it's been updated since then. Public defense attorneys were extremely busy in taking lawsuits in New York City early in the pandemic for people who were incarcerated, and those were individual cases, not the ACLU's kind of large-scale suits where they're trying to take cases for very large numbers of people, instead for an individual person who's incarcerated and at risk for COVID-19. And then as well for people who are in immigration detention centers. So I think I'm going to close there. I'm a little short of my time, which almost never happens, but I'm really grateful for getting the time to talk to you about this at all. Oh, one other super interesting organization. Many of us have read about, I really want to note, many of us have read that many people are at risk of eviction. On the whole, many of those suits do not show up when people are evicted. The states have suspended evictions. There's some reports that the suspension of evictions has not been that effective. That often goes to specialized court. So in that tracker that I had, there are some, I don't have those on here, there are some eviction cases, but it almost certainly really understates the number of evictions. But it was during the state suspensions of those. One of the big lawsuits that we have now, Professor Blake mentioned eminent domain or taking property. The National Civil Liberties Association has taken a big lawsuit on behalf of apartment owners, large apartment owners, saying that the prohibition on evicting people, that is saying that you have to leave because you're not paying rent, unconstitutionally takes their property without compensation. So again, you've got very mobilized interest organization that politically tends to be pretty compelling to us. But I really want to note the significance of private law firms and individual public defense attorneys and immigration attorneys who've been trying to get people out of detention. And the private law firms that go to the bigger money cases, those are insurance cases and refunds for vacation, some employment cases. There's some interesting stories there too, but I wanted to make sure I didn't go over time. So thank you very much for this opportunity, really grateful. I look forward to the conversation. And I know that's a lot, and I know that the constitutional issues that Professor Blake raised are super important. So I look forward to conversation on any part of this. Thanks so much. And I think I can stop there.
Great. Well, let me thank both of you. This is pretty fascinating to get, sort of the broader contextual overview and then focus on specific legal cases. I'm going to open it up to Q&A, but, as the moderator, I always get to ask the first question, which is great. And with two speakers, I try to think about a common thread, which is, in thinking about both these talks, one of the questions that I have is, okay, well, we know that things are changing, right, as a result of the crisis that we're currently in. But what does this mean for the path forward, right? So, thinking about Dr. Blake's noting that during times of crisis, the courts are more deferential. But we also know during significant crises, and you're obviously studying the Great Depression, sometimes it sets, or FDR's response during that period, it changes the context, right? And power dynamics change during these crises. So what's the path forward? And obviously this is speculative, but what do you think it looks like? And then taking that same thread for Dr. Sterett's talk, I'd be really curious to see, and I love what you've done in terms of showing kind of the distribution of different types of cases. I wonder what they look like just in terms of the cases that we see in a typical year compared to now. Like how have the sort of distribution of those cases changed over time? And are we going to see some persistent effects? I appreciate the mention of evictions because that probably will be an area where we may see, many more cases going forward. So it's a little bit about, what do you guys see sort of speculative about the long-term implications based on what we know from the past?
That's a great question. And so, I sort of concluded my remarks with talking about the potential for a fight over compulsory vaccinations and whether that raised privacy or religious liberty concerns that the court is likely to give weight to. Political scientists never make predictions because when we do things like say, yeah, Hillary Clinton was going to become president of the United States. But the fact that we are terrible at this game is not going to stop me. And I'd be really curious to hear Susan's thoughts. I don't think there's going to be a vaccination case that reaches the Supreme Court for two reasons. One, I don't think that defending the rights of anti-vaxxers is nearly as big a priority for religious right organizations as other issues. As Susan was telling the sort of the types of narratives that places like these different religious right organizations want to tell, and because it's not as a high priority issue for them, they wouldn't want to take this issue and lose. And I think that there's a decent chance that they would lose. There would be at least some votes to overturn the Jacobson precedent, I think. But I think that the court would try to avoid this by not even taking the case. Like Roberts, John Roberts is a very smart politician who highly values the court's sort of the way that the public views the court. And so avoiding a controversy is probably better than taking one on and resolving it in a particular way. And so I don't think he wants to hear a vaccination case either. And so I think there are going to be all sorts of interesting lawsuits, some of which involve questions of constitutional law, and some of those will get settled by the Supreme Court. But as big a public health issue as compulsory vaccination is going to be, I don't know if it's ultimately going to be the sort of lasting constitutional legacy of the COVID-19 pandemic. But Susan, feel free to tell me that I'm wrong.
Oh, I wouldn't dream of telling you that. A couple of things. I want to get to the questions that are which are super interesting, that both Erick raised and are in the chat. And I've taken notes on that so that I won't forget. But if anything falls out of my brain, please let me know, because it happens a lot. On the compulsory vaccinations, I want to go to the point that William just made, which is savvy politics. It's just not a pretty look. Like, it's just not. You're going to find someone super sympathetic that for good reasons, not getting a vaccine. And it was not pretty, and it was extremely racist when it was enforced in the early 20th century around the smallpox vaccine. It's a reason that messaging is super important, and messaging and building trust in the medical community. This is outside legal coercion, which we'd like to go to really quickly, but it's super relevant to all our lives in UMBC as well. But the medical profession has, in a lot of ways, not always built up trust with in particular communities of color. It's a reason that it's really important that somebody featured in the New York Times is African-American and a UMBC alum, and I believe first in her family to go to college, on the vaccination development. That's, I mean, scientifically, that's wonderful. I'm so proud she's a UMBC alum. It also matters on the messaging. Similarly, the Surgeon General is a UMBC undergraduate alum, and he's walking a really fine line right now because he's still employed within the Trump administration. But the messaging is going to be really important, and there's a lot of trust rebuilding to do, and everybody with any sense in public health knows that coercion is not a pretty look. So I'm not engaging in predictions any more than William is. But the questions that we've got in the chat are fantastic. Now, so Quinlan, when we can meet in real life, I'll take you out to lunch, because you've now named my my research agenda, which is largely overlooked. The people who do disaster law, and that's a really new field, like to look at law as final sets of order from courts of appeal. Although everybody knows that it's the games in court filings and going back and forth that matter a whole lot. So when Quinlan asked in the chat about how does this compare with other disasters, so my cheap and unpleasant answer is what I showed you is only cases that mention COVID-19. So all of those are brand new. But on the other hand, they all build in previous cases. And again, with Mr. Garola's case, which never mentioned COVID-19, and yet it's in the context of a pandemic and firefighting and imprisonment, I want to note that it far exceeds the reach. So it partly, and people don't do research on these court filings on the whole. There were some earlier RAM cases, there are some efforts, even though, again, my pitch and my training has always been this is where it matters in people's lives. So there are some ways that we don't know. The other way that helps a little bit is that the national government and oftentimes state governments have what's called sovereign immunity for damages for them having screwed up. So you can work around that a little bit. So for example, you can get a settlement out of levee boards, which people did after Hurricane Katrina, but it's kind of pennies on the dollar. It's still for what you lost, and it came in 2017. Think about if you had to wait from 2005 to 2017, I think, good, bad, or indifferent, you were moved on with your life. And I want to thank Laura Madison, who's my research assistant, who's worked on this. And you can tell that what I like to do is Google around a lot. Like, this does not show up in the New York Times. But at any rate, so for one thing, all these cases are brand new. For a second, they build on previous disasters. For third, largely what you get are settlements out of organizations that are not centrally the national government. For example, the Army Corps of Engineers that was not held liable, even though, and they didn't settle, they just thumbed their noses quite rightly, I mean, legally quite rightly, not morally quite rightly, about lawsuits around levee failures in Hurricane Katrina. That also goes to the point of having crappy plans, which I think Joshua was too polite to use the word crappy. Bad plan, okay. Thank you, Mr. Marbury, for leading to more deaths, like not having a mask mandate. So there are all kinds of preliminary rules. One of the things is sovereign immunity. But secondly is you would have to show that you in particular were injured by that. And that's one of those legal requirements for getting to court. Plus, you'd have to have a lawyer who wanted to take it, and that would have to be that there'd be a lot of money that you could get in that, or you'd have to get a private interest public interest organization who's interested. And it's very hard to show that you in particular were hurt by not having a mask mandate for COVID-19. You could have worn a mask. Your friends and family could have worn a mask. It wouldn't have stopped it. And so it's not clear that a mask mandate hurt you. So again, I'm not defending that, but it's a reason that looking at, first of all, lawsuits as naming problems, not fixing them, And secondly, linking really nicely with all the public policy communications efforts for other ways of addressing problems is really, really important. So that we know that the messaging around, and this is a reason that you saw it at the Democratic National Convention, when you can show somebody was hurt. Remember the young woman whose father died? And she argued because it was that not wearing a mask was modeled at the highest levels of government. The folks who crafted that know that messaging around individual stories is much more compelling than general stats about the effectiveness of masks. It just is. I mean, there's some social science around that too, but it means partnering with the social science and others who know something about messaging is super important. And Mr. Marbury, to the extent that your family and friends and neighborhood have been hurt by not having masks widely worn, definitely my deepest sympathy to you. The Times and the Times recognized this morning that with COVID so widespread, almost all of us know someone who has been ill. If we do not have a family member or friend who's been severely injured, that would include myself. I can name a number of people who've been ill, at least one of them who was young and healthy and was very severely ill. So again, the fact that I talk in this academic-y tone, I do not want to diminish the level of pain, many of it experienced personally by people, and I recognize that, and that's a better form of communication. So no, suing the government, I would recommend some of the social media strategies that we've seen around as a public policy strategy around who's been hurt by not having a mask.
Great, thank you, and thank you for the responses to each of the questions. I want to open it up and see if there's others who have questions. Otherwise, I have a couple more at the ready, but if anyone wants to jump in, that's great. And also, if you wanted to add anything, Dr. Blake, in terms of the questions that came in, certainly feel free.
No, I want to keep the conversation going forward, so I'm happy to take some more questions.
Great. Anyone else want to jump in and ask a question? You know, I'll kind of frame it this way in terms of the question. You know, one thing that you touched on, Dr. Blake, regarding sort of the compulsory vaccine and whether governments do it. You know, one thing we might be thinking about too is, what about the private sector deciding that they want to make it, you know, employment contingent on you being vaccinated at some point, and who has access to the vaccine, and whether that can kind of lead to greater inequities in terms of employment or concern. So less about, you know, whether the government makes it compulsory, but more about, you know, can businesses decide that it's going to be a requirement for them to be hired, and could they do that, and would that be okay?
Yeah, that is a great question. And the answer is, I don't doubt that businesses are going to try to take that tack. I mean, it would give them a financial advantage. The problem that would prevent you from going to court is you need to be able to argue that what a private actor, in this case, you know, a corporation, is doing is unlawful. And if you look at employment non-discrimination laws, either at the federal level or the state and local level, there are many things that employers are not allowed to discriminate on, but there are plenty of things that they can discriminate on. You know, if Google decides it doesn't want to employ redheads, I'm screwed, right? Because if Google refused to hire me because I'm male, or because I'm white, or because of my religion, I could sue them for violating either state or federal law. But no non-discrimination statute covers, well, okay, I should couch this carefully. A few places, including Maryland, say that you can't discriminate based on HIV status, but none that I know of have said that you are prohibited from discriminating on the basis of vaccination status for COVID-19. And so what we would need to see happen is for city councils or state legislatures in the next several months to pass those laws in order for them to take effect. You cannot rely on the Constitution and its guarantee of privacy to help you out in this situation, because the privacy protection contained in the Constitution is privacy against government intrusion, not corporate intrusion. Constitution says no state shall deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. So, the most obvious example of this is Colin Kaepernick. If the government arrested Colin Kaepernick for taking a knee, Kaepernick would have been freed because that would have constituted unconstitutional government discrimination. But for Colin Kaepernick to be discriminated against by his employer for taking a knee, that is perfectly legal, or at least it's perfectly constitutional. Whether it's legal or not, that gets into interesting conspiracy against the restraint of trade stuff. But the point is, the privacy aspects of the Constitution wouldn't protect you, and it would require governments to update their non-discrimination laws. And I don't know how many parts of the country are willing to take that step forward.
Great, thank you. And I
see. I'm sorry. I just saw Joshua's question come in.
Right. I was just gonna...
Schools are different. Schools are run by the government, and so the schools have an obligation to not to discriminate. However, I think that public schools could easily say that you have to be vaccinated in order to attend, because that's what they already say. Different jurisdictions have different levels of tolerance for vaccine exemptions based on whether they want to accommodate religious minorities or not. But there is no obligation that they do so. So if a school district wanted to crack down and say, this time we mean it, guys, everyone has to be vaccinated against the measles, they could do that. In fact, there was this big sort of measles outbreak that caused New York to tighten its vaccination laws or its enforcement of its vaccination laws several years ago. So I could see that happening when it comes to COVID, but in the context of private employment, that's very different.
So, and maybe there will be an exception here if it's a charter or private or parochial school. Would that be still going to be regulated by the same standard?
Maybe. So, almost every school, no matter how private it claims to be, accepts some federal funds. And if the federal government wanted to say, as a condition of receiving government aid, you must require all your students to be vaccinated, that could be a way to compel private schools to play by the same rules as public schools. And I think that sort of a restriction would be upheld in court. Although it would take Congress wanting to get aggressive on private schools, which they might not want to do.
Great, thank you. Are there other questions that people want to ask? I noticed, Dr. Sterett, in terms of the list that you had, there were very few actual cases around schools. I'm wondering if there was anything that sort of stood out to you as particularly interesting.
The main things around schools were teachers' unions objecting to being told they have to go back to school. We just had a question about, and again, we're in an ongoing, really a disaster cascade. It's just layered in terms of existing inequality. and ability to work from home or not, and the ability to support one's children working from home. So, I mean, every part of that. So I don't want to narrow the question, but at any rate, since we're in an ongoing disaster cascade, we can expect other ones. And I understand that we're drawn to that really quickly, but the thing I want to note is that the large scale failures in this country are around that can be named in court are around business failures that for not getting compensation, and that's also where again the money can go. So we might have millions of school children who are getting behind, but courts are not a place that that's going to get fixed. We also had a question about proof of vaccination before flying or entering a certain region, and COVID safe flights. You know, just a quick, I mean, that's the kind of question that Professor Blake is more likely to want to answer. But just very quickly, we all know, I think, don't we, that you need, in many states, in order to enter the state, you need, it doesn't mean it's in force, but you need to carry proof that you had a negative COVID test in 72 hours. The other thing is that many states right now still offer conscience exceptions for vaccination requirements. It's one of the ways that these outbreaks happen, for example, that Professor Blake mentioned, and one of the ways that people are trying to sort out what kind of communication might improve vaccination rates. Because it's not just a religious issue. It's, I don't want to police your religion. I mean, really, some of it's pragmatics from states. I don't want to police your religious beliefs. So you object to vaccinations for whatever set of reasons, and that's fine, you can. And we could imagine some of that going, but it means that the people who use the conscience ones are more likely to be affluent, well-educated, and white, and they're more likely to be able to figure out how to litigate, even if there's no particular money available in it. But at any rate, did Professor Blake, did you want to address the whole question of, because I know people really like these normative questions. Do you want to address the question of proof of vaccination before flying?
Yeah, so you got there are two questions in there, because there's what can a state or another country require in terms of you must show this in order to have the right to enter, and that's different from what an airline has the power to do, to say before you step foot on our property, you must pay for a ticket and show us that you have proof of vaccination. I think that actually in this instance, because of the severity of the pandemic, both the corporate actor and a government actor have, they're probably equally likely to win in court, despite the fact that they kind of have to play by different rules, and that normally government discrimination against, only certain parts of people from certain parts of the country can come here and other people can't. In normal times, that would never fly in court. But the scales have really sort of flipped in terms of like how much liberty are we willing to trade off to get a certain amount of safety.
A quick note, since Professor Blake mentioned other countries, I think one of the things that's been disorienting for some number of Americans, and this could well be age-related, I have no idea what polling looks like, that can be a bit disorienting, is the idea that international travel, for good or ill, used to be a breeze for Americans to many parts of the world. You wave your passport and you get in throughout Europe. There are countries where you had to get a visa ahead of time. It could be denied for whatever, foreign policy kinds of reasons for a while. China wasn't letting in Americans long before COVID. China, I mean, I've traveled to China for I've been very fortunate for work reasons, and sometimes they would grant you a 10-year visa for as many entries as you want, and other times they grant you a 10-year visa for one entry and that's it, and there was no particular reason. Like that, it's up to them. And so one of the things that's disorienting for a lot of Americans who do some international travel is the idea that because our COVID outbreak is so poorly managed, that we are definitely not desirable travelers into other countries, because even with a negative COVID test, it's not that clear who we've been exposed to or when we've been exposed. And so other countries have been not particularly welcoming Americans at different parts of the pandemic or different stages.
Well, I mean, we've always been annoying tourists internationally. We're just now annoying and dangerous.
We've been able to get in. Well, yeah, I know, but we can be annoying and waive our passport and get in, and that's been less true.
Great. Yes. Well, good points. And thank you both so much for joining us today. This has been just an excellent talk, and I appreciate both of you staying on time and allowing us to get these questions in. I know it's 1 o'clock now, so out of respect for time, again, I want to thank you. Next week, we will have Bill Wells, who's the Senior Vice President for Business Development for the Baltimore City Housing. So we will take up some issues around COVID-19 and the implications on housing in the context of Baltimore. So I hope everyone will join again next week for that. And just thank you guys so much. We really appreciate you taking the time today to join us.
Thanks for the great questions.
Thanks.
Bye. Take care.
All right. Take care. Great. And if there's students still remaining or others who want to ask any questions, feel free to use this opportunity.